10:30 at night, the 5th of June, 1944. A German signals intelligence post at Cherbourg. A lieutenant of the Horchdienst, the German listening service, reports to his regimental commander that the volume of Allied ship movements and transport aircraft activity building up across the Channel points to a high probability of invasion that same night. It is, as far as the surviving record shows, one of the most accurate single warnings issued by any German unit before the invasion actually began. It changes almost nothing. Within hours, more than 800 American C-47 Skytrains and British Dakotas, carrying some 13,000 paratroopers toward Normandy, are crossing the Channel in a formation large enough to fill radar screens that, by this point in the war, barely exist anymore to fill. Pause on that. A lieutenant got it right, hours before the invasion, and it still did not matter. This is not a story about German radar simply failing to see what was coming. This is the story of an early warning network that had already been physically wrecked, deliberately jammed, and systematically deceived, all at the same time, on the one night it needed to work perfectly, and of the airborne armada that flew straight through the resulting confusion. Part 1. Germany had spent much of the war building exactly the kind of coastal detection system meant to prevent a surprise like this. Beginning as early as 1942, German engineers constructed a dense radar network stretching from the Netherlands down through Belgium and along the French coast, ultimately reaching roughly 92 individual stations by the spring of 1944, combining long-range Freya sets, capable of detecting aircraft and ships out to something like 75 miles under good conditions, with shorter-range, more precise Würzburg radars meant to guide searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, and night fighters onto specific targets once a general warning had already been given. On paper, this was meant to give German commanders hours of advance notice before any Allied invasion fleet came within sight of the beaches. Time to alert coastal divisions, move reserves, and prepare a coordinated response rather than being caught reacting to a fleet already unloading on the sand. The Freya sets that anchored this network had been developed years earlier as Germany's primary long-range early warning tool against Allied bomber streams over the Reich itself. And repurposing the same basic technology to watch the Channel for an invasion fleet made sense on paper. An aircraft or ship approaching at any reasonable speed should have shown up as a steadily strengthening return on a Freya operator's screen well before it came within sight of the coast. The Würzburg sets working alongside them operated on a shorter range but a much finer resolution, originally designed to direct anti-aircraft searchlights and guns onto individual bomber formations, repurposed here to track specific contacts a Freya station had already flagged for closer attention. Part 2. Allied intelligence had spent nearly as long working out exactly how to defeat that same network before a single soldier needed to cross the Channel. British scientific intelligence services identified the specific operating frequencies of both the Freya and Würzburg systems well before D-Day. Information that fed directly into a sustained bombing campaign against the radar stations themselves in the weeks leading up to the invasion. That campaign was deliberately spread across a wide stretch of coastline, rather than concentrated narrowly on the actual invasion sector in Normandy, a targeting choice meant to avoid telegraphing exactly where the real landing would occur. By the evening of the 5th of June, that campaign had destroyed or disabled 76 of the original 92 stations. Only 16 remained operational anywhere along the coast Germany was supposed to be watching. The choice to spread the pre-invasion bombing campaign across the wider coastline, rather than concentrating it narrowly over Normandy itself, was one of the more quietly disciplined pieces of the entire Overlord deception effort, requiring Allied air commanders to accept a less efficient use of bombing sorties against radar targets in exchange for preserving the secret of exactly where the real landing would occur. Striking the Normandy sector's radar stations too heavily and too obviously, while leaving the rest of the coast comparatively untouched, would have told German intelligence almost everything it needed to know weeks before the fleet ever sailed. Part 3. Whatever those surviving 16 stations could still see that night was, in turn, deliberately buried under electronic noise. Aircraft of No. 100 Group, Royal Air Force, a unit built specifically around electronic warfare, orbited over the Channel broadcasting jamming signals tuned to the Freya network's own frequencies, an operation given the code name Mandrel, creating what amounted to a moving fog bank of false returns and static across exactly the airspace the invasion fleet needed to cross. A German radar operator working one of the handful of stations still functioning that night was not looking at a clear picture slowly resolving into an obvious invasion fleet. He was looking at noise. Deliberately manufactured noise, layered on top of whatever real returns his equipment could still manage to pick out from beneath it. No. 100 Group's mandrel operators flying that jamming pattern over the channel were themselves in an unusual position for aircrew on an invasion night. Their job was not to attack anything or drop anyone, simply to fly a precise, sustained orbit broadcasting noise for hours while the actual invasion fleet passed beneath and around them. A mission with no dramatic climax of its own, judged successful only by the confusion it produced on someone else's radar screen many miles away. A form of combat almost entirely invisible, even to the men flying it. Part 4. Even the real returns that did get through were not, in several places along the coast, what they appeared to be. Operation Titanic, part of the wider Allied deception plan for the invasion, dropped roughly 500 dummy paratroopers, nicknamed Ruperts, sewn from sackcloth and stuffed with straw or sand, from around 40 aircraft at 4 separate locations, well away from the actual airborne drop zones. Each dummy carried a small explosive charge, timed to burn away the telltale cloth shortly after landing, delaying the moment German troops on the ground could confirm what they were actually looking at. Alongside the dummies, aircraft scattered strips of radar-reflective chaff, codenamed Window, designed to paint additional false returns onto whatever German radar was still working, while small teams from the Special Air Service played recordings of gunfire and battle noise near the dummy drop sites, reinforcing the impression that real airborne forces, not scarecrows, had come down in these entirely wrong locations. The Special Air Service teams attached to Operation Titanic faced a considerably more exposed version of the same deception mission, parachuting into occupied France alongside the dummy figures themselves and playing recorded battle sounds from portable equipment near the fake drop zones. Real soldiers risking capture or worse to sell a story built mostly out of straw-stuffed sacks. A detail that separates Titanic from a purely technical trick like radar jamming. It required actual human beings to physically commit to the lie on the ground, at real personal risk, for it to hold up under any close German inspection. Part 5. The genuine airborne assault this deception was built to protect was, on its own, one of the largest single air movements attempted up to that point in history. More than 800 C-47 Skytrains and RAF Dakotas carried roughly 13,000 American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions toward their drop zones behind Utah Beach that night, part of a combined Allied airborne force that would put more than 23,000 paratroopers and glider troops onto Norman soil by the end of the day, once British and Canadian formations were added to the total. A formation that size, even with individual serials spread out to reduce the risk of collision and flak concentration, represented an enormous, sustained mass of aircraft crossing the channel over several hours. A genuine signal any working, unjammed radar network should have picked up clearly and immediately. Every C-47 in that formation carried a crew that had, in most cases, trained for exactly this mission for months, without knowing precisely when or where it would actually happen. Holding tight formation in the dark, with running lights reduced to the minimum needed for the aircraft immediately alongside to stay in position, navigating largely by dead reckoning and pre-briefed timing over a channel crossing most of them had rehearsed dozens of times in training, but were flying for real for the first time that single night. Part 6. That the Cherbourg listening post's accurate warning barely moved the needle had almost as much to do with German command culture as with the technical chaos unfolding on Allied radar screens that same night. Months of a separate deception effort, Operation Fortitude, had spent the spring of 1944 convincing much of the German high command that the main invasion, when it came, would land at the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing point from England, defended by a notional 1st United States Army group that existed mostly as fake radio traffic and dummy landing craft. A single accurate report from one listening post at Cherbourg, describing exactly the kind of activity an invasion would produce, arrived into a command structure already primed to interpret any such report as a feint meant to distract from the real landing still expected further up the coast. The lieutenant's warning was not lost, because nobody heard it. It was lost because the men who could have acted on it had already been told, for months, to expect exactly this kind of report to be a trick. Fortitude's fictional 1st United States Army Group existed almost entirely as an elaborate signals and physical deception. Dummy landing craft moored visibly in English harbors nearest the Pas-de-Calais, fabricated radio traffic simulating an entire army's worth of routine administrative chatter, and a real, senior American general publicly associated with the notional force to lend it credibility. All of it built over months specifically to survive scrutiny from German intelligence officers who had every professional incentive to look for exactly this kind of trick and still come away convinced Calais was the real target. Part 7. The honest version of why Germany's radar network failed to give useful warning that night resists any single explanation, and it is worth naming all of the contributing failures together rather than picking the most dramatic one. 76 of 92 coastal stations were already physically destroyed before the invasion fleet ever sailed. Most of the 16 that remained were being actively jammed by Mandrel throughout the crossing. Genuine returns from the 800-plus aircraft airborne armada were, in several sectors, mixed with entirely artificial returns generated by window chaff and reinforced by real but deliberately misleading dummy landings inland. And the one report that did correctly read the situation arrived into a command culture already conditioned by a separate, months-long deception campaign to distrust exactly this kind of warning. No single element of that failure, the bombing campaign, the jamming, the dummies, or the Fortitude deception, would likely have been sufficient on its own to blind Germany's coastal defenses that thoroughly. Together, arriving on the same night, they were. It is worth being honest, too, about how much of this deception's success can actually be measured versus assumed after the fact. Historians studying the German response on the night of the 5th and 6th of June have generally concluded that the combination of jamming, physical destruction, and deception measures produced real, significant confusion. But assigning a precise number of hours saved, or a precise share of credit to Titanic's dummies versus Mandrel's jamming versus Fortitude's months-long groundwork is not something the surviving German records support with great precision. This channel would rather describe the layered failure honestly than claim a false precision the sources themselves do not offer. Erwin Rommel himself, commanding the coastal defenses that were meant to respond to exactly this kind of warning, was not even in France on the night of the invasion, having returned home to Germany for his wife's birthday, partly because weeks of poor channel weather had convinced much of the German command that no invasion was likely in early June at all, a scheduling decision made independently of any radar failure, but compounding the same night's confusion at the highest levels of the chain of command that would have needed to act on the Cherbourg lieutenant's warning. By the time German coastal commanders began piecing together what had actually happened along the Normandy coast, American and British paratroopers were already forming up inland, seizing causeway exits and bridges the seaborne landings at Utah and Omaha Beach would depend on within hours. The confusion Germany's own radar operators experienced that night bought exactly the kind of time Allied planners had spent months trying to manufacture. Hours during which reserves that might otherwise have moved immediately toward the real beaches instead waited for confirmation that never arrived quickly enough to matter. Weather itself deserves its own mention here, since it was not manufactured by any Allied deception planner, and yet did nearly as much work as Mandrel or Titanic in keeping German expectations pointed away from the actual invasion date. Rough channel conditions through the last days of May and the first days of June had genuinely convinced a number of senior German officers that no landing was imminent, an assessment Eisenhower's own meteorologists were racing to overturn on the Allied side, spotting a narrow window of marginally acceptable weather that German forecasters, working with less complete data, simply did not see coming in time. None of the paratroopers riding inside those 800 C-47s that night knew anything about Mandrel jamming patterns, dummy paratroopers stuffed with straw, or a fictional army group's fabricated radio traffic sitting in English harbors far to the east. They knew only their aircraft's engine note, the red light that would soon turn green, and the drop zone briefing they had memorized for weeks, entirely unaware that an enormous, largely invisible electronic and psychological campaign was unfolding around their flight at the exact same moment, built for the specific purpose of making sure the aircraft carrying them arrived over France as a surprise rather than an expected target. The 16 surviving German radar stations, jammed and overloaded as they were, did not go entirely blind that night, and scattered German units along the coast did report unusual air activity in the hours before the main landings, fragments of an accurate picture that simply never assembled themselves into a single, actionable warning in time, arriving instead as isolated, contradictory reports scattered across a command structure already primed to discount them. 15th Army, the German formation still held in reserve near the Pas de Calais, even after the actual Normandy landings had begun, remained partly frozen in place for days afterward, a decision German commanders made in part because Fortitude's fictional army group was still, even after real fighting had started elsewhere, considered a plausible enough threat that redirecting those reserves felt premature, a slower motion consequence of the same deception architecture that had confused the coastal radar network on the invasion night itself. The dummy paratroopers themselves, absurd as sackcloth and straw figures might sound in retrospect, were taken seriously enough by at least some German units that real search operations were launched to hunt down the phantom airborne forces they seemed to represent. Soldiers and vehicles diverted for hours, chasing an enemy that had never existed anywhere except in the imagination the deception planners had deliberately constructed for them. Whatever the precise share of credit owed to jamming, dummies, bombed-out radar stations, poor weather forecasting, and months of separate deception planning, the men actually flying that C-47 Armada across the channel that night crossed into airspace that should, by every pre-war assumption, Germany's own engineers had built their radar network around, have been watched, tracked, and met with a coordinated response the moment it appeared. It was not, and the paratroopers it carried had already landed and begun forming up before German commanders anywhere along that stretch of coast fully understood what they were actually facing. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More nights when the truth was sitting on somebody's desk, correctly reported by somebody paying close enough attention, and still arrived too late or too discredited to change what happened next. A lieutenant at Cherbourg got the story right at 10:30 that night. 800 aircraft crossed the channel anyway, and nobody who could have stopped them believed it in time.